Findings for last year show South Korea noted a rebound in the number of newborns for the first time in almost a decade. We'll have more on this reality on Press Perspective today. Hello and welcome. It's Friday, February 28th here in Seoul, and I'm Min Sunhee. Today we start off our talk on various social issues here that made international headlines with a focus on last year's rebound in the number of newborns here in South Korea. For this, I have Kelly Kasulis Cho with the Washington Post in the studio. Kelly, welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
I also have writer Colin Marshall with the pundit's take on the media coverage today. Colin, it's good to have you with us.
Glad to be here, Sunhee.
Right, Kelly, we'll start with you. Let's start off with the piece of news I shared in the clip before our talk. So Korea saw a rebound in the number of newborns for the first time in 9 years last year. The foreign media covered this as well. What appears to have been the focus of their coverage?
Yeah, I find a lot of the media hype around this very interesting. I think this issue in South Korea has been talked about in such doomsday terms that any reversal in the trend of a worsening and worsening and worsening birth rate is really exciting to people. It's certainly been covered in the Western media. For people who don't know, basically what happened was between 2023 and 2024, the birth rate went from 0.72 children per woman to 0.75. So we're still talking about South Korea having the lowest birth rate in the world by far, actually. And we're talking about a fraction of a person, I guess, if you want to think about it in that way. My understanding is the explanation so far has been that there's kind of this post-pandemic surge in weddings. People wanted to hold their ceremonies until after COVID was cleared. And then in East Asia and in Korea in particular, studies show that marriage and childbirth are more closely related. So marriage is kind of seen as something that you need to do before you family plan. And there's a higher correlation between people wanting to start families when they're married versus in other countries it's acceptable to do that out of wedlock, so to speak. So yeah, I mean, I don't want to be too pessimistic, but I think this will be a phenomenon that should be really celebrated if it continues to sustain itself year after year and show improvement.
Right. Colin, as Kelly mentioned, a number of reasons have been offered to explain this rebound. What are your thoughts based on your observations?
Well, I've been able to make some fairly close observations because my wife is pregnant now and she's having twins in the summer. So I'll be adding to the birth rate myself soon. But yes, you know, we've been touring the Sanhu Chorewon, where the postpartum care centers, and they all say, "Oh, August, you'd better book soon because we're filling up at that time." And partially that's salesmanship, but I think it's actually true. They are seeing as well. They're feeling it too, that industry, and as well, from what I understand it, in vitro fertilization clinics are also doing pretty booming business these days. Maybe because a lot of people have delayed having children for quite a while here in Korea, but also with that sort of thing, I mean, you get more multiple births and you get as well the couples trying for a second kid. So I think that is a factor that is often not closely examined in just discussions about this is, yes, there are the couples who are having the first baby, but also the ones who are having the second one or sometimes even the third one. And that in a way is the more effective result of these government incentives being provided. It seems to work less well to incentivize the first baby than to incentivize the second one for the couples who already have one. That idea, well, now there are payments we can get. We know what it's been like the first time, so let's see if we can, let's see what we can do about the second one, you know. But so far, it's a hard phenomenon to explain, much as the global decline in fertility is hard to explain. Recently, I was hanging out here in Seoul with a New Yorker reporter named Gideon Lewis Krauss, and his piece about global population decline, which he was researching here, just came out a few days ago. And he covers a number of different angles, talks to all kinds of experts in Korea and outside Korea, and comes up essentially with the idea like, we don't really know. We don't know why population declines. We don't know why the birth rate declines. We don't really know why it comes up either. But you know, there are a number of ways that our thought process about it has changed. And this is the line that sticks with me. He says, we should accept that it's discomforting to consider reproduction as just part of a normal consumer calculus to be weighed against trips to Venice or expensive dinners. And I think that mindset, which was very common in my generation, is shifting as well, whether it's in the West or in Korea.
Right. Kelly, as Colin mentioned, there are a number of government incentives aimed at encouraging couples to have children. And one British daily linked the Rebound last year to such government incentives. For those of us who may not be aware of these incentives, could you tell us a bit about them and what are your thoughts regarding their effectiveness?
Yeah, I'm always a little bit skeptical about the celebration of these government benefits as being a factor that could convince someone to become a parent if they're not already planning to, or if someone's on the fence. I frankly have reason to believe that they're just quite not generous enough to make that difference. So basically my understanding now, and I haven't written a piece about this in a couple of years, but a couple years back when I did, compared to what's been happening in 2024, it's gotten far more generous what the Korean government is willing to give families. During Yoon's administration, the Korean government actually, for the first time ever, established a ministry that is dedicated to the demographic crisis. That doesn't just mean the fertility rate. We also have, you know, a high elderly poverty rate in Korea as well. But what we're seeing is that in 2024, the average family that is having one child will be given in total about 29 point something million won, almost 30 million won over the course of 8 years in cash benefits and subsidies. So that's pretty generous. I mean, that's almost a proper salary. The issue is that that's distributed over 8 years, right? And the rewards, from my understanding, are a little bit more generous if you have a second child, right? So we're encouraging people who are parents to have even more children. I know that there are some housing benefits that have been proposed and you know, piloted in the past where loans are cheaper for families that have children, or you know, there are certain subsidies for things like formula, childcare. Parental leave has been increased as well, which is different than maternity leave. We're talking about an aggregate total number of months that you can take for things like your child getting sick, or you know, needing surgery abroad, or having issues with schooling, things like that. So I do think that, I don't want to say any of this is bad. I think it's certainly good, and it puts Korea on the map. We often compare these things to Europe, where social benefits in many countries are far more generous. And this is certainly far more generous than what people in the United States are getting. For instance, you basically just get a tax write-off in a lot of parts of the US if you have a kid. Granted, their birth rate is about 1.66, where here it's 0.75. But, you know, as I mentioned, I haven't done a piece on this in years, but a couple of years ago when some of these cash benefits were first being piloted and floated in Seoul, I did speak to Korean parents, and they said it's certainly helpful, but it's just not enough to make them want to have a kid. If you're already deciding that this is a sacrifice or a choice that you want to make, it helps to have a couple $100 extra every month, but it's not enough. If you feel like you can't afford it, you're not going to afford it because of those government benefits, if that makes sense.
All right. So apart from hopes for potentially greater government benefits here, similar to those in Europe then, Colin, this is the million-dollar question. How can Korea work to ensure this rebound in newborns last year is not simply a one-time phenomenon?
I'm not sure it's something the state itself can do, but one way that it could continue, or one way that this bump in the birth rate could build upon itself, is if it results in simply more families or more young children being just seen around. A lot of the problem with falling birth rates in Korea or in other countries is that people of reproductive age often just don't see any young children around them. They don't see families forming around them, so it doesn't seem normal. And social media plays a part, of course, depending on what you're seeing when you scroll Instagram or what it may be. If it's all your friends and acquaintances just eating expensive dinners and dragging their roller bags through foreign airports, you're going to feel like, oh, that's what you do. I mean, it's natural. You see people like you doing these things, you're going to feel like you should do them. I mean, we're human beings. And if you see them having families instead, you'll probably feel more inclined, though not necessarily convinced to do it, but it'll seem normal. And a lot of it is what seems normal. And one problem in Korea that I mentioned, Gideon Lewis Krause's article, is about how just people stopped seeing, people in their 20s and 30s in Korea stopped seeing having families as normal. They stopped seeing it as the default. And so if it's not the default, well, boy, what should I do instead, right? So again, government programs, what government programs can do, I mean, that's limited. And for us as well, the payments were not the deciding factor in choosing to have children, but they don't hurt, certainly. But I would say it's more of a This is more about how the social environment around people changes and just what do they see, what do they feel around them, what seems normal to them. If there are kids around them, if their life is a no kid zone, they're not going to feel like having kids. If it is a yes kid zone, more will.
Right. Meanwhile, Kelly, the Washington Post recently carried a very interesting article about a Nobel Prize winner who decoded the reason why people were choosing not to have children. Could you tell us a bit about this particular coverage and your takeaway from it?
Yeah, that was actually one of the most interesting pieces I've read about this issue in a long time. It was an opinion piece looking at Claudia Goodwin's research, which is basically looking at the global fertility rate and its decline through the lens of macroeconomics. She theorized, after doing a lot of research about various countries around the world where we're seeing an extreme decline, a mid-rate decline, and also increasing birth rate, about what's going on here. And she suggests that basically there are two big factors that play into this. One is how quickly women entered the workforce in a given country after World War II, and the other is how quickly men sort of socially caught up and realized that they should be helping out with the home, housework, the children, if their significant other, who is a woman, is working. And so what we see is in South Korea, for instance, where the fertility rate is the lowest, women have some of the highest number of extra work hours that they're putting in the home over their husbands. And women here often work, right? It's just like the United States. Same for Japan and Italy, Portugal as well, I believe. And she also mentioned that there's a big difference between countries where the birth rate is extremely low, like South Korea, and some other countries where it's lower than ideal. And the factor that kind of separates those two nations is how quickly that country develops. So South Korea is famous, right, for economically developing at like a lightning speed rate. We often look at the miracle of the Han River and its post-war development after the Korean War as this big celebration of Korea turning itself around and building a legacy as a major economy. But what we also see is that Korean women entered the workforce and maybe the family unit did not catch up culturally as much. And we talk about this anecdotally all the time in discussions about the birth rate in Korea. A lot of women just don't seem to see the point in having a child or a family or getting married anymore, because for them it feels like signing up for extra labor when they're already making their incomes and dealing with financial responsibilities that maybe they didn't have a generation or two before, when women were more okay with staying in the home and relying on a man.
Right, and talking about men helping out women at home, findings for last year, Colin, show that the number of men here in the country taking childcare leave soared past 30% for the first time. What do you suppose the broader implications of this finding for the Korean society?
Yes, the rate of paternity leave taking has increased, and also the amount that is the maximum has been increased, as I understand it. It used to be 10 days maximum. Now it's 20 days, which by the standards of certain other countries is still not that much. For some men, I think that it seems trivial enough. It's like, why would I take it and disrupt my relationship with the office? It's not like it's 3 months or 6 months like in Sweden. And here in Korea, I remember this burst of articles a few years ago about Swedish paternity leave. And this was the coinage of a new Korean loan word, I guess we should say, latte papa. Or latte papa, which is not linguistically Swedish, but a word that comes from Sweden. And that is the word they use there to mean a father on paternity leave who can be seen drinking a latte out of a paper cup while wheeling the baby carriage around. And in Sweden, it's a neutral term, maybe a positive term. But here, it has taken on a bit of a harsh edge. Some use it derogatorily. So, he's a latte papa. The implication for some being that he's just using his paternity leave to hang out. He's not doing anything important. He's just taking time off, effectively. That's the sort of negative spin on the latte papa. But this is one in a long series of, I feel like I see every few years, the Korean press hold up some foreign country as an example. We should be like Sweden, we should be like Denmark and all that. And there are problems with that. But I think that stigma will probably also fade. I mean, women have also encountered it, taking a full maternity leave as it used to be sort of oh, you shouldn't do that. You might poison the well at your job. So this is, I suppose, natural. People will get used to it. I assume that paternity leave will not become a more alien concept as time goes by, but I think it'll be pretty slow going. But as you can see, as you've said, the rate is increasing. It'll probably continue.
Right, hopefully. Fingers crossed for that. Moving forward, Kelly, findings by Statistics Korea show life expectation among Koreans fell for the first time in 4 years, with Korea apparently ranking 33rd out of 38 OECD nations. Now, to be clear, these particular findings, though, represent the sentiment of Koreans back in the year 2023. How do you explain these findings?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I want to start by saying that this is a subjective feeling that people are conveying through polling and surveys. So, you know, on a given day, I might feel that I'm a 6 out of 10 in terms of life satisfaction. The next day, I might feel a 9 out of 10. And so I believe the way that this question was posed was for people to give a 1 to 10 rating of how satisfied they feel. So you can fish for a lot of answers about why it seems that it's declined since COVID, but it's not really clear from that survey data. It could be that post-pandemic, the first couple of years, people were just happy to be out in the world again and resume their lives. For those that weren't in Korea during the pandemic, it was certainly among the more strict countries, especially up until probably mid-2022, I would say, where in the US and Europe, people had kind of forgotten about COVID already, unfortunately, at that point. What I did find interesting about the survey is it suggested that higher income people had a tendency to say that they are a little bit more satisfied with their life in Korea than lower income people. And older people had a tendency to say that they were less satisfied compared to younger people. This is all kind of intuitive and makes sense, right? I think, you know, Korea's been dealing with a few things. The devaluation of the Korean won against the US dollar, which makes travel far more expensive and other life pleasures. The economy has been growing year to year, but not at the rate that maybe people hope for or are used to, especially in generations prior. There's certainly been a lot of political anxiety in the last couple of years as we went from a Democratic Party president to, you know, PPP or Conservative Party president, who is now facing, you know, an upholding of his impeachment and or prison time. Korea in general is kind of this economically aspirational culture. There's a lot of studies and surveys out there to show that Koreans rank money and finances as something that's much more important to them than, say, other developed nations. And so you can kind of grasp at straws for why this phenomenon is happening, but it's kind of just one data point in the, you know, sea of data points about happiness around the world. The other thing that it pointed out was that the suicide rate has gone up a little bit recently. Unfortunately, South Korea is known as one of the highest suicide rates in the modern developed world, and that is a chronic issue that this country is dealing with. And I think there's probably quite a clear difference between being suicidal and being unsatisfied with your life at any given time, which is what that survey question was asking. Again, I think it's probably a lot of these big life factors that are going on. And also, South Koreans tend to be lately lonelier in the younger generation than previous generations. People aren't getting together, they're not cohabitating or marrying at the rates that they used to be.
Right, unfortunately. And staying with this particular survey, Colin, those at the top of the life satisfaction list are countries in Northern Europe, this including Finland, Iceland, Sweden, and Denmark. What do you suppose are their common traits, and how do they differ with those here in the country, do you think?
Yes, this is, as Kelly mentioned, self-reported data. So we're on scientifically shaky ground, but one important element to start with is that definitions of happiness can vary. And as I've read for years and years about these surveys, the reason these countries in Scandinavia plus Finland always being the exception in that region of the world, these Northern European countries, they come up at top because the definition of happiness, they tend to read it as contentment, which is a word that exists in English but is not often heard in the United States. It's, are you content with your lot in life? Are you basically okay with it? And if, as I understand it, if they feel basically okay with their lot in life, then they're happy. That's how the question tends to be interpreted in those societies. Whereas in the US or in Korea, they might not, respondents might not feel the same way. Like, oh, but I don't live in Lotte Castle, but I don't have a Genesis. You know, these things, there's always something you don't have and you'll feel, it seems like Korea and the US kind of have this in common, that any little thing you don't have will make you miserable, potentially. There's something about just the way that what you have and what you don't have gets, how that felt experience is, and that messes with the data. in these kind of surveys. There is a Swedish word that comes to mind to bring up another Swedish term, lagom, which is a word meaning, one of these words with no equivalence in English, meaning it's enough, you have enough. I think IKEA has used this in their branding occasionally. Like, it's when you feel like I have not too much, not too little, but enough. Of course, in America, maybe in Korea, you never have too much. You always want more. But this lagom idea is a very Scandinavian or perhaps Northern European concept that is difficult to even get across in English. And I'm not saying it's a good thing or a bad thing civilizationally, but hilariously, lagom has been used as the name for a Korean skincare brand. So kind of like hygge, the Danish word hygge, to this sort of coziness and comfort, that also was a big fad word in Korea. So I think these, even if the meanings don't come across in Korea, they can get used for branding. But you know, a few years ago, I remember the founder of Oh My News, whose name escapes me, went around the world, tried to find the happiest country, and came away with Denmark as the answer. So, oh, now we have to imitate Denmark. But I mean, the memory that always comes to mind in these situations is years ago, I was interviewing a very high-up cultural bureaucrat in Korea. And he just said to me, while speaking unbroken for 80 minutes during this interview, he said, you know, in Sweden, everybody speaks Swedish, of course, and everybody also speaks English to a high level. So Korea should do that. In my mind, I'm thinking, okay, Sweden, population 10 million, and it's in Europe. Like, is this a relevant comparison? But I think this comes up again and again. Korea comparing itself to countries that with which it has nothing in common. So that's not a very productive exercise, I would say.
Right, and also here in Korea, Kelly, on a more somber note, more than 8 out of 10 people here in the country have been found to support euthanasia, which is legal in some countries, illegal in others. Do tell us a bit more about this debate on euthanasia here.
It's a long debate. Actually, when I first saw this question, I remembered back in the United States when I was just a kid in public school, this topic was the annual school debate class subject that was assigned to us. And I remember students getting very heated back then. And in the United States, this continues to be a very heated issue that is dealt with on a state-by-state basis. On a personal level, I know someone whose grandfather actually moved in the last months of his life to a state where it was legal for him to take a medication that would end his life because he had terminal cancer. So we see this debate going on and on all over the world. It's interesting that 8 in 10 Koreans, according to polling, support it. When you talk about the subject, it's very emotional for a lot of people, and the terminology around it is a source of controversy and debate. So some people say euthanasia, some people say physician-assisted suicide, medical aid, and dying. And in the legal context or like the advocacy context, there are small differences between all of those terms. But we're basically talking about the ending someone's life for the sake of limiting their suffering or their physical pain, and it usually involves another person either administering that end-of-life care or giving them what they need to self-administer it. The arguments for and against it are, a tale as old as time. And in the against it category, I think in Christian factions and religious factions in particular, there's always the argument that you are allowing people to play God, or states to play God, physicians to play God, and who are we as people to interfere with the natural course of life? People who argue with that side say, you don't know what it's like to see someone suffering and essentially waiting for their body to give out while they're in extreme pain, and I can empathize with that. There's also arguments that it's a slippery slope. There could be an abuse of power situation where someone is making it look like some kind of physician-assisted suicide, and it's not. There might be consent issues. And then there's a question of who gets to opt for this and under what circumstances. I mean, there are parts of the world where people with certain mental health disorders are being advocated that they should have the ability to have their lives ended or end their lives, whereas in other parts of the world, it's basically only if you're in the last leg of dealing with a very painful terminal illness. So it's a spectrum where how do you draw the line? I think those are the arguments against it. The arguments for it is that it limits pain and suffering. It gives people maybe some semblance of a sense of agency when life has dealt them very unfair cards. It's already hard enough being sick not being able to choose how your life ends and when. Some people would say is kind of a matter of losing dignity in that situation and choice. Some people say that, you know, there's less loss of autonomy and less burden on family members if people are allowed to opt for this treatment or this end-of-life care willingly. I wanted to point out, I saw some statistics from the 2022 physician-assisted suicide program in Oregon, and the most frequently reported end-of-life concerns were people felt that they were no longer able to enjoy their life the way that they could before they got sick. They were worried about a loss of bodily functions or autonomy, a loss of dignity, burdening their family members when they're no longer able to care for themselves, and inadequate pain control near the end of their life. So they were worried about basically, you know, suffering in a hospital, not getting the right pain regimen, and then maybe not even being able to speak and advocate for themselves. So yeah, this is a debate that will continue on. We'll see what Korea does.
I'm sure it is. And like you mentioned, it was an essay topic for me as well when I was back in school. That was decades ago. We still have no answer. Kelly, as always, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts today. And Colin, I hope you had a lagum discussion today.
Yes,
have a great weekend. All right, well, on that note, we say goodbye. Have a great weekend. See you next week.